Well, hello. Welcome to the Randomizer panel, where we will talk about random things, about randomizers. On this panel, we have a bunch of just various developers of different randomizers, and we just kind of talk about both their experiences and how to either modify the game at the low level and how to write the algorithms and different advantages of different kind of approaches. So have everyone introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Boardface. I'm the developer of Final Fantasy IV Free Enterprise.
Hi, I'm Tetra. I've written randomizers for Zelda 1 and Super Mario Bros. 2 US.
I'm Testrunner. I'm the developer for Ocarina of Time.
Hey, I'm Carcat, ASM dev for ALTTP Randomizer.
I'm Vitor, ALTTP developer, wrote the randomization algorithms, things like that, website.
Okay, let's just kind of just get right into it. So before we get too far into the how to make a randomizer, I want to first kind of go over like our vision of what randomizers should be, because part of making a randomizer here is it's basically just, it's like game design. You're making a game here. So the goal before we start tinkering with things, we first have to really understand what do we want to do, what should be happening here. So usually the main culprits that people kind of look for are you want to have a randomizer to create something that adds both replayability, a way to like play the game again, and have a new way to play it. And you add additional challenges that didn't exist, as well as from the speedrunning aspect, adding the ability to like route the game again, because once you've solved it, it's hard to reroute, and that's kind of part of the fun. So I don't know if I'm kind of starting with a Boardface here. You want to talk about what you look for in a randomizer?
One of the things I love seeing in randomizers is how they bring out all of these strategies that you'd never consider in a vanilla speedrun. It's discovering little undiscovered corners of the game that people have just overlooked over time because they're not important, but then you find incredibly random and strange interactions, and sometimes that does bleed over into proper speedrun strats. Not often, but it's just really fun to see something that you thought you knew from your childhood just completely get deconstructed in a fully new way.
I kind of like randomizers just because it's a way to make you think on your feet, and speedruns can get very technical, and I really just enjoy the challenge of routing on the fly. It's definitely a different way of playing than a rote speedrun where you're just going from muscle memory.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm really easily bored, and I've always been a big fan of roguelikes and roguelites. So for me, it's more a case of like, how can I fit this game into being a roguelike? And because it's a different experience every single time. Because even twice in a row, and I'll get, it loses the replayability fast. Most games for me, just after one or two iterations, because I want to have that like discovered, like you're opening the chest, and you've got the whole like sense of excitement, like, and you lose that if it's the same game every single time.
I just like playing my games over and over again. So it's all replayability for me.
Yeah, it's kind of funny for me. I'm probably a bit of an oddball here because I'm very interested in just more of the theory involved with everything, and for me, the PCG, the procedural content generation, where you make random content in games, is a very, I guess, new-ish in many ways, but it's a highly explored field and it's very interesting. And I think randomizers fit right into that. And it's kind of just really cool to see what people do to be able to try to approach the randomizers and how that affects what kind of games you make. So moving on, let's start getting to the meat of things. So if you want to make a randomizer, the first thing you kind of need to do before you even start thinking about any of the theory is you need to see, is it even possible to randomize this game? And usually the first thing you need to do is figure out how is the data in the game stored? Like how are the items stored? How hard is it to change it? Where can you find the information, and so on and so forth, and like what kind of limitations there are.
It's all compressed, always.
Yeah, so when it's compressed, it's good luck finding it. Hopefully someone has made some sort of really good documentation, but it's gonna be a challenge. So I think that would be nice if we have all the panelists kind of talk about what they have to do and the challenges they have to overcome to able to find this data and what kind of things they need to kind of look out for?
Well, I was actually lucky when I started working on Free Enterprise because I was able to start by just using the source code for FFWorkster, which is a very, very comprehensive File54 editor by PinkPuff that already exists. And so just getting started, I was able to look at where a lot of the data that people had already tracked down was found. And then just over time, as my development got more complicated, you can just build off of that now that you know where to look. So definitely, if you have something that a game that you'd like to work on, definitely see what prior art there exists for it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. For both of the games that I've written randomizers for, there's been pretty extensive ROM maps already created on romhacking.net and out there on the internet, as well as level editors. So using those is a great opportunity to be able to see, like, for instance, if you generate a seed and it doesn't quite work out for some reason, to just be able to load it in an editor quickly and see what went wrong.
Yeah, I mean, for LTTP, there was a documentation. There's a disassembly. It's not for the right version of the game, but it was close enough. And, you know, everything is a little bit off. It's, you know, a couple bytes here, a couple bytes there. But when you're looking through it all, you know, you can usually find it. It's close enough. And, you know, when it's not quite the right byte, you can usually, oh, you know, the master sort is, you know, value, whatever, 5, and there's a 5 right nearby. The documentation is almost right. You can usually figure it out with just a little bit of brain power application.
Yeah, so I also do Goonies 2 randomizer, and I recently spent a month disassembling the game just so I could find where the items were being loaded and how they were stored in tables. Asked around, talked to a whole bunch of people who had done other like hacking of the game, and they're like, hey, this is where I found this chunk of data, or where I found, you know, this bit of information like related to the jumps and different things. And then in ALTTP, I just kind of throw Carcat at it, and he tells me where things are. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, OOT is kind of lucky because it also has pretty good documentation already, because there's, you know, any game that has a level editor for that, someone has to have documented, and the things that exist for like a level editor is usually the same things you'd use for a randomizer. But it kind of, when you start working with it and start adding things to the randomizer, then you start noticing that suddenly certain items can't go in certain locations. So I mean, for OOT, some of them are more clear, like the ice traps, for example, can normally only be in chess because just how they're coded. You can't have someone gift you an ice trap, although that's kind of a recent change. That's no longer a limitation. But you have to basically just start trying to putting items in different locations and just trying them out and just see, like, oh, I can't put this item here for some reason. The game crashes or something. Or I get in the game soft locks because maybe certain locations require certain items being in certain locations. Mm-hmm. And yeah, dealing with that, it's a lot of testing. It's a lot of just kind of let's just try everything. And every once in a while, you find people report new things that you never thought of, and you're like, oh yeah, I guess that doesn't work, huh? But usually what you have to do, when you get to this point where you start realizing these limitations, you have to start either deciding whether or not you accept it and just prevent those items appearing in those locations, or you start diving into code and start trying to figure out why it doesn't work and how to fix that. So that kind of brings us to the next part, which is ASM. And in this case, basically ASM is just the compiled code. So usually when you're looking at the game's, like, you know, the game's files, you don't have the source code available. So you're just kind of looking at the end product, which the developers probably don't really look at either. And in order to modify it, you kind of have some understanding about how the game code is structured and how to write code. And that helps getting around some of these problems. So can we have some, I guess starting with board face, to talk about like the kind of ASM that you feel like, the kind of ASM that you need to write in order to deal with these. And
Sure. pretty good example, actually. So Free Enterprise has a feature called the Z flag, where it replaces the final boss's sprite with another one just from another game. It seems like just a simple data swap straight up, and for the most part it is. A lot of smaller sprites that we swap in, I just run an image converter on it and replace the data, and that just works fine. When I was first doing this, I was trying to get the Lavo sprite from Chrono Trigger in there, and he's kind of a big guy, and I found that I was running into memory limitations, and I can only get about half of them on screen. And so at first I was like, yeah, I'll just work around that limitation. Later decided, no, that's not enough. I want all of Lavos. So that's where you start adding the ASM to take the code that would normally read the data and teach it how to read additional data from somewhere else. And that's an example of how you start coding to work around those limitations.
Well, I was going to mention that in contrast to a lot of the other folks on the panel, I actually haven't done hardly any ASM modding in my randomizers, and I think it's really important to note for folks out there who are thinking about writing a randomizer on their own that they don't necessarily have to get into quite this level or need a technical background in order to write a randomizer. It definitely does help, and there's a limitation to what you can do by only modifying game data and level data. But I think it's worth pointing out that it's not an absolute requirement, and it's possible to really write quality randomizers without necessarily even getting into assembly code.
Yeah, one of the things that I found is there's a difference between what players consider to be an item and what the game programmers necessarily consider to be an item. You know, certain things may not even be in the item table because they're hard-coded as a plot event, and it just writes it into your inventory. And now, you know, players want that in a chest, and you have to, you know, you may need to write an entirely new item, you know, using a free item ID to, you know, realize this idea that, you know, for example, if you want to find half magic somewhere, like that's not an item, or the capacity upgrades in Link to the Past. Those aren't items. It's just the game just kind of gives them to you. And now if we're going to put those places, we have to create items to do that. So when you're sort of creating, you know, entirely new, you know, bits and pieces to add, that's almost certainly going to require that kind of thing.
As I'm a big fan of when we added Key Sanity, we had to create all new item IDs for all the keys, the maps, the compasses. They didn't exist. When you're in a dungeon, you just get a key to the dungeon and it's loaded, kept in memory. So when we split them out, we ended up using high number IDs. And then we found out a very special one was if you go to Zora and your item ID is above a certain number, it turns it into a splash for no reason whatsoever. So we had to recode that. That was it was a fun day where it's like, Zora pops up and throws something, but then nothing lands. You don't get anything to pick up. It's the weirdest thing ever. It was just like, if it's above 50.
Oh, wait, it was the GT big key.
Yeah, it's one of those things.
Yeah, it's probably not that important of an item. I think you can do without it.
Well, you can actually just, you know, you need Candace Samaria. No, there's a door at the top. Never mind.
I mean, OT has a lot of the same kind of limitations. But another thing I know that a lot of randomizers like to add is more progressive items, because a lot of times in the game you'll find like upgrades, like get a level 1 sword and level 2 sword and so on and so forth, or levels of ammo capacity, like, you know, strength and so on and so forth. And in the game, typically, these usually are in a forced order. So the game doesn't expect you to be able to get in that order, and if you can, using glitches or whatever, it just gives you the highest level. So in Randomizer, we like generally to be able to, you know, still kind of capture that vanilla feel where you get them in order without forcing the player to actually get the locations in order. So usually this gets resolved by like creating this new item that's like progressive, so that every time you get the same item, it gives you like the next level of the equivalent. So I don't know if you want to add to any of those kind of things.
But that was for us. It was a large choice to do progressives because the game kept being like you walk into Kakariko, get the gold sword, and you're just like, well, there goes the game.
Yeah,
I mean, everything's on easy mode, and after a while, you kind of get really tired of everything being too easy. So you put in you capture the I'm going to step up as I play through the game. Hopefully,
I know that the Metroid game is kind of a similar issue because when the different suits in most of the Metroid games are also linear in the game, but when you get a suit, it actually doesn't give you the previous suits, unlike a lot of these other things. But the higher level suits have like all the behaviors of the lower level suits. It's just like hard coded in. It doesn't like add them together. So you get gravity suit and you have like heat protection even without various suit. And because of that, it means that like whether the order you get them in is like completely unknown, and which means that like you start going to like the prime games where there's 3 suits. It starts getting more and more likely to be able to, you're just going to end up with the end game suit, and then the other items are now like useless. So, kind of working toward making things more progressive can add, make the game more frequently be at like a more reasonable progression instead of like immediately going straight to like final end game right at the beginning.
But you still allow for the ability to be like, you got all 3 suits in one place so that you get that like.
Yeah. You still can get just like all 3 suits like in like the first locations.
It also helps mitigate some of the downgrade problem.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these, because they're forced orders, they assume you're going to get them in a certain order. So it's like, oh, you got the blue mail, and now you have the blue mail. Doesn't matter that you had red before, because it doesn't check, because,
Yeah, just overrides it.
yeah, why would it?
Yeah.
I ran into an interesting issue with Zelda 1 where I implemented progressive upgrades. But for those of you who played it, you know that with boomerangs, what's considered the upgraded boomerang is actually considered by many speedrunners to be a downgrade. So it was a question of, do I do progressive upgrades with the boomerang, or should I just leave them as the upgraded boomerang? And it was a really interesting question to ponder. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of stuff can be like really complicated, and these kind of decisions really kind of play into the whole back into your visions. Like, what do you want the randomizer to be? Like, how do you expect it to play? And a lot of times you just have to try and then do some play testing and just see how it feels and make decisions. Like I know in the Metroid games they don't do progressive suits, I believe pretty much intentionally, but they try to force the suits to not be like or I think there are options that you can try to force the suits to not just all be in the game, because that kind of trivializes a lot of it. So like we won't find all the suits in the same area, and you won't find them in like Bryn Star criteria and that kind of stuff. Some of them do those kind of things. But yeah, the downgrade is kind of interesting because it kind of leads to another bigger problem, which is sometimes if you are able to get to certain places early or whatever, missing items or get items out of a bad order, sometimes the game just can't handle it all and just crashes, and it's kind of a freaking problem. I know I've talked to a lot of people who've tried to work on like a fusion randomizer, and that's a major issue because that game is got something like over 100 event triggers, and they like have to be like hit in order, or like things don't work, and like items don't work unless certain triggers are hit and stuff like that. And like I know Skyward Sword's even worse, because in Skyward Sword, if you get the items out of order at all, like if you get any item before the first item, which is the slingshot, then the game crashes. So yeah, so if you wanted to do a randomizer, like, you have to be able to, I mean, there's a certain point, like, well, you could accept the limitation that the slingshot's me first, but most likely if you want to have like a randomizer that people would be able to enjoy, you need to be able to change the code so that I can handle that kind of stuff more properly, which is hard, right? That's like, is where if you don't feel comfortable with ASM, this is where you start asking for help, and maybe someone can find a way to look into this for you. But I don't know if anything to add to this kind of topic.
I'm good.
The only other thing that you might do with ASM is sometimes you just want to add more features that aren't in vanilla, like maybe new items or stuff like that. Like for example, in OOT, we have things like a forced wallet upgrade. So which it only exists under certain game modes. But if you're playing like Shop Sanity, you need like significantly more money. So it's like as a game design decision to make it easier to get more wallets, we added more wallets to the game. And there's like stuff like that, and it wasn't very complicated ASM, so we want to do with it. But I know that some people, and the OOT devs there's a lot of people who just want to contribute. So there's a lot of people who's like, hey, I really want, to have like rainbow tunics or whatever. And I'm just like, yeah, whatever. If you want to do it, go ahead. But so there's a certain amount of, I think a lot of people just really enjoy kind of cracking into the code and figuring out how it works and being able to modify. It's like somewhat empowering, I guess, and to be able to like make something. So there is the element of being able to get the minimal, trying to get the randomizer work, but there's also some people just want to go beyond and make it something that they can call their own.
Quality of life and
Yeah, a
fun
lot
new
of quality of
items.
life. Yeah, I know that in Wind Waker, Wind Waker is, for those who aren't really familiar, the beginning of the game is actually incredibly linear. There's a lot of restrictions about where you can sail that are just like invisible walls basically around, and you can only go in certain directions or whatever for a large part of the beginning of the game. And so the way they handle it is they basically just start the game in basically like an end game state, so that you can have access to like everything. And they made a lot of other like changes, like they hacked in the swift sail and stuff like that, so that you can just, which isn't it isn't even a game in the original. It's only in HD, and so they added a new item because it like really cuts down the travel time that isn't really critical to being able to play a randomizer, but it makes it a lot more fun because just is a lot of quality of life. I mean, and that's a big part of free enterprise as well. They use something similar.
Definitely, Final Fantasy IV originally is very slow. You can't run. All the menus just kind of slide in at their own leisure and slide back out when they feel like it. And just taking a lot of that stuff out really makes it a lot more appealing for racers.
Yeah. And OOT, I think a lot of times there wasn't a lot of work into it, but I think in the more recent, we have some devs like Fig who's working a lot on trying to make the game less painful to play.
Like quick swap boots.
Yeah, quick swaps. There's a bunch of pending PRs that I'll get to eventually, but but I'm always impressed by the work that the Wind Waker team did on that, and there's a lot of other randomizers that have done this. Like, it's not just exclusive to Zelda. But moving forward, once you kind of have the game done, you have the game figured out, you can modify the game. Now at this point, a randomizer is possible. And so when you do this, the next part is start figuring out the logic, because if you want to make a randomizer, you have basically two options. You either just kind of throw the items down randomly, like congratulations, you got this far, and it's very likely that most of your seeds will be unbeatable. And some people are fine with that. I think most people are not. So you need to be able to have the logic, have some understanding of where you can go with various items and like what items even are, and just kind of like the structure of the world. And there's a few ways to kind of talk about the logic and like things that you need to do, but I guess we'll start with VTorp since you're pretty knowledgeable about this stuff.
Oh, sure.
Good luck.
I know a few things about this. Link to the Past uses currently location lists, which it basically, you take every location in the game that's going to have an item be put into it. And they could be real items, they could be fake items that you use for your logic, kind of like in ALTTP we use an Aghanim defeated event, which allows you to do stuff with the big red bomb, like without having to have the hammer, kind of things like that. And we then, for each location, we give it, here's the exact requirements to get to this location, not thinking about anything else in the game. What is the absolute necessary to get from Link's house to this location? And we use that because it's fast. It's fast and dirty. It gets you there. We can generate, very, very quickly because of that. The much, much better option is the second one, the world graph, where you kind of use mathematical graph theory to traverse and look at the different things as they add up as you're going along them. OOT uses graph, you said?
Yeah, OOT uses graph.
Graph. The entrance randomizer for Link to the Past also uses graph. But yeah, the graph way is I think inherently the stronger method, but it is also, when you do any kind of graph traversal, much, much slower. So what you're weighing is being more correct in your generation versus the amount of time like you want it to generate in.
Right. Yeah, and the big thing about graph is that with location lists, like you have to write the full entire rule, the absolute rule of all the items that could possibly need to reach that one location. But if you notice a bug in your logic or whatever, or just to change the game that you need to change the rules, figuring out what those rules are for all those locations is very hard. So it's very difficult to maintain and verify. But the idea of the world graph is that now you describe it, you have a bunch of areas and regions, and those regions have items, and you have like, connections between these regions. And so the idea is that you only need the rule to actually go from location to location, and then the logic will step through the world and figure out what these like full rule is later. And it's much easier to maintain, because then it's a lot easier to, if you're like just tweaking a rule in this one place, you can just change that one connection on everything that's behind it.
Yeah, well, I think we ended up actually hybridizing it where we have a region, which is a set of locations that has common requirements. And then, so like Eastern Palace, well, not Eastern, that one's terrible. That one's free. Desert Palace has like, it's the book can get you in. So all of the locations inside either require the book or they require like the flute, the gloves, and the mirror. And then that just wraps all the locations inside. So it's kind of graph-based, but not really.
Yeah, it's like halfway there, yeah. And also, you kind of mentioned with entrance rando, as if you want an entrance rando, then having a graph description is pretty critical, because this way you can just take one region and move it in another location. You swap regions around, and all you need to do is just change the rule between those connections. You don't have to change what all the rules for all those locations are, because actually knowing what those are is going to be incredibly difficult to write out, and you'll be pulling a lot of hair if you weren't using a world graph at that point. I don't know if Zelda 1 or Free Enterprise used any kind of similar methods for these kind of things.
Well, I mean, Free Enterprise's randomizer, since I was just kind of developing experimentally without much of this theory, I think it ends up mostly as location lists, but it actually kind of builds itself up as a graph while it's doing that, and then just when it's doing its verification step, because it uses the random fill, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, yeah, it just kind of builds a graph from location lists and then traverses that to verify.
Yeah, my logic in Zelda 1 has been very similar, because the game is composed of a series of discrete screens or rooms and dungeons, and it's really easy to define the relative requirements to get from one screen to another or to enter levels. So I basically the best way to describe it is that I simulate a player going through each screen one by one, and if they're able to reach another screen, then we'll just sort of do a breath first search, or sort of trial and error way of getting through the seed. And what I like about that is that it involves less custom code to really define the logic of the game, which means that you don't have as many issues with an error in the logic causing an unbeatable seed, and I find it simpler to implement and write and debug.
Yeah, and it will help save people other time, because everyone else is going to look at the logic at some point and make sure it makes sense to them too. And if it's in a graph form, it's a lot easier for them to read. The other thing is kind of about logic, and this is kind of the more critical part, is you need to make sure, well, ideally, if you're trying to make sure it's beatable, you need to make sure that this seed can't ever get into a state where it's unbeatable. So, for example, keys. Oh my God, keys. Yes. Pretty much every randomizer dev is like, what if we just remove keys? And it makes things a lot easier. And then for OT, we removed the keys, and then no one played it.
The other trick is to remove the doors.
Yes, you have to remove the doors. That's true. That's the critical part I forgot about, I think. But yeah, but it doesn't apply just to keys. So like, for example, in Super Metroid, there's certain, and Metroid Prime and other games, a lot of those item locations you go to get an item, and you need the item to escape the room. And so it's very easy now to like, okay, well now do you require the item to be in those rooms to be able to escape? Do you modify the room so you no longer need the item to escape? Or do you just or do you just make the logic never require the item there unless you have the item to escape it, and then just tell players like, well, don't go there and don't get screwed, kind of thing. And that last option is usually what they do in a lot of these kind of games, because everything else is just so constraining on what you can do with the logic. But for keys, that this is the more common thing in Zelda, and any kind of consumable progression item. In Ocarina of Time, you have the bomb choose. It's this kind of similar issue. But the idea is that you have to assume that the player is going to use the keys in the worst possible way, and that you can still beat the seed. So if there's like 2 doors and one door has got progression, other door is junk, then you need to still say both the doors still effectively require 2 keys. They each will require you to have found 2 keys to go through because you might have used on the wrong side or whatever.
Gets better when you have keys that open more key doors.
Yes, yeah.
And you start getting to these weird situations. Our favorite is in Ice Palace. If you have the big key, you can unlock the path to 2 more key doors. So having the big key means now you have to have 2 extra keys for any door
Right.
that you would be able to go through.
Yeah, and it's kind of this major problem because since we have to make this assumption about this this gross usage of keys, a lot of the vanilla layouts of keys in dungeons are now not possible to be generated by the randomizer. So for example, let's say, Palace of Darkness is a pretty
Palace of
famous.
Darkness.
Yeah, that's we've rewritten the logic multiple times for that one.
Yes, but for Create Time, it's probably the easier one to grasp. Is you have the Spirit Temple. Spirit Temple's got some crazy logic involved with it, but in Spirit Temple, you can go through the left side as child if you have the ability to get there, and there's a key and a key door which takes you to the main room. And if you go there's adult. On the right side, there's a silver block that requires 2 strength upgrades, which has another key and a key door, which takes you to the main room. The problem is that in vanilla, if you go to the left side as child and get a key, there's no way to go to the right side to waste the key because the locations of the silver gauntlets to move that block is behind the child side. So in the vanilla game, there's only the 1 door accessible, even though, but in the randomizer, we don't know while placing items whether or not you're gonna have silver gauntlets or not. And there's also, using the current logic, there's no real understanding of where the doors are really either. And being able to determine whether or not what doors are actually accessible at any given time while placing items is actually very difficult. And so most randomizers that I'm aware of just basically just assume the worst and just make sure it's beatable. But occasionally they can lead to problems. Like in Fire Temple and Ocarina of Time, there's, in the beginning of the game, there's 2 locked doors. One of them's behind a hammer requirement, which is normally the hammer's very deep into the dungeon, so it's not a problem vanilla. And there's 1 chest location. So that means both those doors require 2 keys, and there's 1 spot where a key can go. So the dungeon's just not beatable ever. Like logic can't generate it. And so what we had to do was we just removed one of the key doors. We removed the door behind the hammer block, so at least there's still a constraint. But this restriction can be pretty can be pretty hard to work with a lot of times, and you have to be very careful working with it. And in Spirit Temples, compounded more, and I think this applies to some other games, but the whole child adult thing makes things complicated because either your child you're able to use some items, and your adult you can only use some other items, and so you have to be aware of what you can what items you're even able to use, not just what items you have at various points.
That's good.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty terrifying. Every time I look at the logic, I'm just like, this makes no sense. I just can't be right. Every time I look at it. And Ocarina of Time, Rob Dog is our main person who works with the logic, and he's like, no, TR, it's right. It's like, wait, but what if you do this? It's like, no, it's right. But yeah, it's crazy. But theoretically, if you wanted to be able to, the keys just make the logic very complicated in dungeons. And ideally, one of the ways we'd be able to approach this in the future is you could place the doors in the logic, and the logic would actually have an understanding of what doors you can reach, and then it would be able to procedurally generate the key rules on the fly. But again, the key rules are very complicated, so any logic to generate complicated logic is even more complicated, and you can kind of imagine why it is kind of a big deal. But it's something we're kind of working on. We kind of need, we can get some sort of horrible feature like lock sanity or something like that. But
No.
it's a feature everyone wants, trust me. No one actually wants it.
I'm gonna put the doors to other dungeons in your dungeon.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be the best. Or what color code the doors.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the way to do it.
Accessibility.
Yeah,
I got 3 blue keys. Oh no.
Oh yeah, accessibility. That's a good point. We kind of didn't talk about that earlier. Yeah, that's there isn't a lot we have to do in OT because most items in your inventory are named. You can scroll over and it's text. But
At least in LTTP, I mean, it was easy to to say, oh yeah, the first pendant, second pendant, third pendant when you're running an MG, but then suddenly it's the green pendant and the red pendant, and we have like 5 to 10% of the players that can't tell the green pendant from the red pendant, and now it's a problem.
right.
So we end up needing to potentially make art changes or layout changes in order to address that kind of thing.
Yeah, we haven't really needed to do that for OT very much, but we have like I know LTP has this too. We have like some sort of a like hash seed. We like have to make sure to choose like symbols that can't be, that can't be indistinguishable or anything like that for like various kind of color blindness and stuff like that. I don't know if this really applies to Free Enterprise or Zelda or any of those such.
Not directly, but another aspect of accessibility is in terms of how difficult the game is for folks who are relatively beginners to it. And with Zelda 1, particularly since there's a lot of tricky combat situations that are very difficult if you're underpowered and not a sub-30 runner, I've added some features to specifically make it so that there's at least one path through the game that doesn't require, for example, killing 10 blue whiz robes with a wooden sword and no ring upgrade. And I find that adding features like that really makes the game a lot more accessible to a wider audience, and I personally feel is really important.
Yeah, sure. I guess got a little sidetracked with that, but that was important to talk about. Yeah, I totally forgot about accessibility. It's actually an easy thing for just game developers in general to kind of forget about, and it is very important to consider. But once you have your logic written and you can edit the game, now it's like, all right, now we can start figuring out how to place items. And so you have one of a few popular algorithms that you can use for actually filling the world. These are the 3 most popular, and most of them are some variations. So the first one is the random fill, or like guess and check. And you basically just place items totally randomly, and you check, does the game work, is it beatable? And if it isn't, you just keep retrying. You retry. And depending on the game, it might be like, you'll just do it a couple times, you're done, or you might be sitting there for like thousands or tens of thousands or more before you finally reach something that works. But one of the big advantages of this is that it has much better bias. It's much more random, and it also is very easy to code, so that's pretty popular. The other one, forward fill, is the other one is pretty popular. It's pretty simple. You just check which locations are reachable and put an item down, and you check what's reachable and put an item down. You just keep repeating. You just keep putting items where it's filled. It's pretty simple, but it actually has a lot of problems. It makes the game very front heavy. There's a lot of early location gets filled, and we can talk a bit later about some of the details. And the last one is assume fill, which is what Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time use, which are a bit more complicated. You basically you start with all items. Like you have your inventory. You start with all the items in the game, and then you choose an item. You remove it from the game, and then you see what can you reach, and then you place it anywhere, and then you repeat. You just remove a random item, see, and then place it. And make sure that because you remove it from the game, you're always put in a spot that that item will never require. You're never going to soft lock it. And assume fill is kind of a best kind of mix. It's both still kind of fast, but it's still a lot more random than forward fill is. I don't know if you guys want to talk about any of the kind of your implementations around this kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, sure. This was one of the biggest things that we, in Link to the Past, we had to kind of overcome, was we started with the forward fill. And we ended up having, when people were racing it, people started seeing some severe patterns.
Can we get a hype for Hype Cave, please?
Hype Cave and Old Man on the Mountains, or a few places that just were like 50% of the time they had something. And that's not what you want. You kind of want it to be as evenly distributed as possible, so that people, when they're faced with a choice between one location or another location, it should be a coin flip. It shouldn't be, oh, I know it's that place because it's always that place. So we tried random fill and determined that we don't want to sit there and run through like 5 bazillion iterations, because while there's billions and billions of valid like fills for the game, you're going to hit a lot more that aren't valid, and it's just the regeneration time was just kind of killing us or the checking time, because that's about half of the algorithm is checking that it's valid. And then assume fill is where we landed. That was LL Cool Dave who kind of formalized it into words, and I swear it's probably the best one where you're just kind of going, I have everything, where can I get to? And we drop an item there. Big problem with forward fill is if you have like locations that are early, every time you're placing an item, you're seeing that same location over and over again. So you're basically just multiplying the number of times that that location has a chance of getting an item. Whereas the assume fill is it's looking at all the locations kind of equally every single time.
Yeah, I think I remember I was doing some testing for OOT, and when you're running assume fill, it's something along the lines of on average, while placing item, about 74% of the world is accessible.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, so items can go while placing pretty much anywhere, the most part.
Yeah.
But there are examples where random fill is like perfectly appropriate. And I don't even talk about Tetra.
Yeah, so I use random fill in both of the randomizers I've created, and to explain a little bit why, I need to go back a little and explain my philosophy about writing a randomizer, which is that since it's a fun project that I do on the side, and it's definitely doesn't pay the rent or feed my cats the way that my day job does. I want to do it in a way that's relatively easy to write and easy for me to maintain. And even if it does have the trade-off that it takes longer to generate a seed when you do random fill, the way I look at it is that folks who are playing a seed for an hour or more, having to wait like 15, 20 seconds even for a seed to be generated really isn't the end of the world in the big scheme of things. So I like doing it in a way that makes it simplest for development. I know when you start getting into games that have way more items and locations than Z1, like Link to the Past, that gets unwieldy, but I like it at least as a starting point until it becomes untenable.
Yeah, Free Enterprise definitely uses random fill just because, it's easy to write, it's easy to start with, and it's also lucky in that it doesn't have any of the inter-dungeon complexities that Zelda games do. A gated item in Final Fantasy IV is just, do you have this item? Great, you can either reach this location or do this entire quest. So it's a lot simpler. So it really depends on what game you're working on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you just consider like the space of like all possible way items could be placed in the game versus the subset of that space where it's just the only configurations that are actually beatable, what percentage of that's filled is basically how good the random fill is going to be. So like if it's like a pretty good percent, like maybe like 1% or more, then you probably won't be waiting very long. You won't have to do many retries. But if you have a game where it's like 0.001% or worse, then it can take tens of thousands of attempts or worse. And depending how slow your actual code is, that can be pretty prohibitive. But it really depends, again, because sometimes the actual generation time isn't so important. Because, like, for example, like I know La Mulana and Rabi Ruby and some of the other randomizers use random fill, and the algorithms can actually take a pretty long time too. But the idea is that their philosophy is that it's fine if it takes a pretty long time to generate a seed, because your seeds are already pretty long anyways, and you just generate a seed when you're not playing sometime. May make like 10 or 20 or whatever, and then when you want to play, you have some like really good ones already available. But I think for like Ocarina of Time, Link to the Past, people generate seeds very frequently. That isn't really an option, particularly for like the website.
Yeah.
Major consideration there too is whether or not your generation is offline or online. Like if your generation is happening on your server, that takes resources, and random fill becomes less viable. Whereas if it's happening on an offline client, and the player is happy with it running for 5 or 10 minutes, fine. If they're happy with it, fine.
Yeah, it's definitely you don't want to bog down a server with just sitting there. Like if 10 people got on and they all started it, now you have your thing kind of kicking off into processes that are just chewing up cycles, and you're like, oh, yeah, okay, no, this is, sorry, you can't generate anything for the next 5 minutes.
Yeah, It's a tough call because, I mean, just like as was mentioned, just going for the more complicated algorithms can really improve your time, but it can make it really hard to develop for and just maintain when you're just trying to you're working on your own making this randomizer, and you have this like huge code base that you're trying to like work with, and it can be really unwieldy. But assuming that you've chosen the algorithm that's right for you, I would say avoid forward fill if you can. But I think that at this point, your randomizer is basically complete definitely at its minimum level. You're able to change the game. You're able to place them. You have a way to make sure the game is beatable, and players will be happy. So at this point, I kind of want to move more towards a little bit of theories and the properties of these different kind of algorithms, and what kind of effects these kinds of things have at a slightly more technical level. I'm not going too far in details. I'm not going to really go into the proofs. I have some of the proofs online. If you're interested, you can message me or whatever, and I can send you some of them. Some of them I don't have, so good luck. All right, so the first thing is, this is probably the most basic one, which is selection bias. And the idea is just that of all the seed possibilities, all the configurations, the idea is that they're all equally likely. You want to be able to have it so that you're not like biasing towards specific combinations over certain other combinations. It's actually pretty trivial to kind of talk about how random fill definitely has no selection bias, which is one of the main things that people really like about it. Forward fill definitely is heavily biased on this, which is part of the reason why I don't really recommend it. It definitely likes having items in the early parts of the game, and that really affects a lot of the gameplay decisions when people are playing. Assume fill is kind of this weird middle ground. As I said, it's kind of this in between. There's definitely certain kind of cases where there is bias. So the main one is that if you have like dungeon items, if you're placing groups of items in a specific order, so you're placing the dungeon items before you place the rest of the items, there definitely is going to be a bias, which affects this. So if you can write your code in such a way that you can do them in any order, that'd be great. But most likely, you're not going to be able to.
Yeah, assume fill has one huge problem in that it could self-limit itself. So like the reason that you would generally place your dungeon items first is because a dungeon needs its dungeon items. And in an assumed fill, you might select 15 non-dungeon items in a dungeon that has 15 locations, and you put all that in, and now you have no place to put your dungeon items.
Yeah, most of these algorithms besides the random fill are a greedy algorithm, which means that basically when it's always placing an item with the assumption that it can keep always placing an item and that it will never kind of like screw itself over, but that's not true at all. It's quite possible. Like I mean, normally in the whole overworld, like Link to Past and OoT, you have something like 200 to 250 item locations, and roughly like 30 to 50 of those items are actually needed ever to beat the game, and so it's pretty easy to be able to place the items down and always having a spot. But in a dungeon, that's a lot less true because now the dungeons have to be in there, and it's really easy to place items in such a way. I mean, for example, in Master Quest in Forest Temple, the very first room of the dungeon is a locked door, and there's one chest in the room. So if you place anything that's not a key in that room, the dungeon's unbeatable. And assume fill has no like logic that takes that into account, knowing like, oh, I can't put anything in this location because if I do, then I will no longer be able to place something I need there. And what will happen is that at some point it'll just fail down the line when it eventually needs to try to place something there, and you'll have to start the whole thing over. And it's a real problem if you have a lot of like constraints like this. So typically, like for like Ocarina of Time, we try to break it up into groups so that parts that are really restricted, like the songs and medallions and shops and stuff like that, we shuffle them individually, and when they fail, which they do a lot, we just retry just those items because there will be some combination that will work. We know we can get it to go, but we also know that it has a high chance of failure, and so we can't really just throw it in the raw pool unless we expect it to, take forever to generate all the time. But yeah, so if you can come up with an algorithm that doesn't have this limitation, something that's a little more dynamic, something that's able to step back and try something different, it was able to mitigate that kind of problem. But with these algorithms that people generally use, it doesn't really be able to handle it. So just be aware that that is a bias that's going to incur from your assumed fill, generally speaking. The next thing is just the item distribution. So a common misconception I hear a lot is that people want to have it so that all locations have like the same distribution, like all locations are equally likely to have progression and so on and so forth. But that's just not possible in pretty much any game. Because as long as there's, for example, even the most simple world, you have like 10 locations and you have one item in it that locks half of them. Well, that item can't be in any of those other half locations because then it's self-locking, right? So already, half the locations are much more likely to have an item. And you can imagine as you add more items, this kind of just continues. I don't know if you want to kind of continue on this one towards like the front versus back heavy and that kind of stuff.
Oh, sure. So in Link to the Past, when we do a new logic, we usually generate about 25,000 or more groups, so then we can take a look at the percentages of where things end up to kind of get a good idea. Is it uniform enough? Because obviously you're going to have variance. You're going to have sometimes the hammer just lands in Kakariko more often than not in your subset that you generated. When you're doing the random fill, all of these are front heavy.
Yeah, everything's front heavy.
Everything's front heavy. The idea is you can't get anywhere if you don't get the items to unlock other places. So they have to have items in the front. Forward fill is just terrible because it literally is looking at, oh, I have these 3 locations I can put a hammer. Puts a hammer in one. And it's like, all right, 2 of those locations I looked at before. Now I have like 4 locations and 2 of them I looked at before. So I'm going to put my next item, and you keep doing this. It's just always going to kind of group up in the front where you've been placing items already. But in the end, it's one of those items just don't generally go deep into the game because of the situation of every constraint that gets added on. So like if you need hammer and then you need fire rod and then you need, or whatever you want to call these items, the more constraints you're adding to a certain location, it just makes it harder and harder to get more items back there.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult. And as I mentioned, all these algorithms are front heavy because what ends up happening is things that have more constraints, they need more items to reach, they're just going to be less likely to have items because anything that's constraining those locations can't be there. And any item that could be constraining those items also can't be there in that particular seat. So generally, there's always going to be kind of a bias towards having more items early in the game. And what ends up happening, you actually kind of get this Metroidvania-like distribution of items, where as you play through the game, items become more and more sparse. And usually when you're about maybe halfway through the game, you have 90% items already that you need to beat the game. And you're just looking for 1 or 2 last items, before your go mode or whatever. And you have most of the world to explore still, because just as you play, things become more and more empty. And when you have something that's forward fill, which is even more biased, it makes that even worse in that sense.
Absolutely. To check the early locations.
Yeah, but it's important to keep in mind that all your seeds, no matter what, are probably going to be front heavy in some form. And so just because you're seeing this behavior doesn't mean that your algorithm is bad, because that's just going to be natural to what's going to be happening when you place the items in any of these kind of ways. So trying to find the right balance of how front heavy it should be is kind of part of the art, I guess, and which is why you do things like generating tens of thousands of seeds to just kind of see what it looks like. But moving on, there's something that's even more interesting here. There's something I kind of dubbed as called memoryless. And this is kind of a term that comes from math. But the idea of memoryless is that at any point while playing a seed, the idea is that we consider all the locations that you haven't checked yet, but you're able to get to, right? That's usually the things you care about when you're running. You're playing through a seed. You're like, okay, I can get to these 10 locations still that I haven't checked. The idea is that we want to have it so all those locations have the same item distribution. That's the goal. And it's really good for a competitive scene, because then it means that because otherwise you can be based on since I found X, Y, and Z item, I know that there's probably going to be an item at this location. But we kind of want to avoid that. We want to make it so that you can't make those kind of calls. And it turns out that if anyone's actually really interested, the proof is a little complicated, but it turns out if you have random fill, if you have no selection bias as random fill, then it becomes, you have this partial memoryless. This isn't absolutely true because some items can't be exchanged everywhere else. So for example, like the medallions, the crystals, like dungeon rewards, stuff like that, those can only be at the dungeon end of the dungeons. And those items are very often required. And so those locations are just gonna be more valuable. And also those items can just only be there, they can't be anywhere else. Like you're not gonna find the hammer at the crystal location. It doesn't make any sense. So that's already kind of mine. So we consider only the set of locations, consider all sets of locations in which all the items can be exchanged, like there's no restrictions on like any kind of like code or anything like that, then those locations are memoryless, which is very interesting because it means that while playing through the seed, you can't make, like just because you know, like, I mean, for example, if you consider like the crystals in Link to the Past, if you look at the Light World dungeons and you see like, okay, I know the light dungeons are like, they're, blah, this is crystal, this is pendant, or whatever. That information doesn't, or you found the hammer and like the ice rod and blah, blah. Knowing what those items are gives you no information about what the other dungeons are in terms of whether they're crystal or not. Similarly, the same things for chests. If you like know you need to do like, you know, Turtle Rock, that doesn't give you information about where the ice rod is. It can still be pretty much anywhere. It's just that you know you need it. So this kind of information is really important for actually like the competitive scene, which is, I know it's often misinterpreted while playing through a seed.
It's true, except for there was a time before we were using assumed fill, where Turtle Rock being required meant ice rod was on the laser bridge.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I can say for sure that that forward fill is definitely not memoryless. I can definitely say that for sure. That's not too hard to prove, but the assume fill is kind of uncertainty, and I think because of that bias I mentioned earlier, how we're placing the items in groups and we're not doing them in a random order, I think that might destroy the memoryless behavior, and there probably is some amount of interpretation going on. Unfortunately, I've tried looking into a proof, and whether this is true or not, and it's actually quite difficult. But if you were able to do it completely random in assume fill, it might be fine. I'm not completely entirely sure right now. But it's something to keep in mind. It's just, again, another major advantage of doing a random fill algorithm, because you know you're getting this property, which is something that you really want for races and such. So I don't know if anyone on the panel has anything to add to this particular topic.
I think you've thought about this topic way more than any of us, so.
Yeah. I'm sorry. But yeah, so the next thing I'll talk about is that we talk more about seed analysis. So a lot of times, like, you have an algorithm that generates various seeds, and you want to say like, okay, let's generate 10,000 seeds, and let's look at the seeds, and how can we know what those seeds are like? Are they good? Are they long? Are they front heavy, back heavy, things like that? So the common one that people have been using is something called the sphere algorithm, which is basically
It was for me to analyze something else entirely. I'm sorry.
Well, it is what it is right now, but the idea is that you split the locations up into, you partition, so you split them into groups, and each sphere, if you have all the items of the sphere in previous spheres, then you're able to get to the next sphere. So like, for example, you would say like you have sphere like 0 to 15 or whatever. So sphere 7, if you have everything from 0 to 6, then you can get everything in 7. That's the idea. And it gives you a general ordering of the items, which is kind of nice because you say like, oh, okay, and now I know I need like blah amount of items to get here, and it gives you some description. But the problem, and the nice thing is that it's not too hard to calculate, and it's and generally speaking, on average, more spheres will mean that the seed is longer, so you get that kind of information. But the problem is that it has a lot of things that it can't really describe well, or things that it can really easily drop my phone and things like that. But like, for example, one of the main things it can't do is if you need to do like 2 dungeons in parallel, and and they're both accessible at the same time. You have all the items to do both items. The sphere algorithm will basically have you doing them in parallel, like the two seeds are like interwoven together, and you'll do like get the first key in both dungeons in one sphere, and get the second key in both dungeons in like one sphere, and like the sphere basically has you going back and forth between the two dungeons, which is like not really how it's going to be played at all. So another one is that kind of going with that is the idea that like it doesn't really distinguish being able to do like two completely separate things parallelly, like the two dungeons, or whether or not those two dungeons are interlinked. Like maybe there's an item in both dungeons that you need to complete each other, and so you actually do need to go back and forth. So the sphere algorithm can't or doesn't identify that. The other one is that it has no real idea of how like big each of the spheres are. It can tell you how many items are there, but it doesn't tell you how big the sphere is. So like you get a key or something, it will unlock like one location versus getting like the hammer, which will unlock like, like 50 locations or whatever. And you look at the sphere and then you don't see that. And it's really easy to look and it's like, oh, I see lots of small spheres, it must mean this, but you have no real idea because you don't know how much that they're really unlocking. But this is what people often use because it's generally easy to use. So I have a proposed change, which I haven't written yet because it's complicated. But basically, you write a solver. You write an algorithm that basically solves the seed. It finds the optimal route to play through the whole seed. And the idea is that this gives you, well, first of all, it gives you a much better idea of the length of the seed because now it actually like tells you like how long the seed is. But the other problem is that, or the other advantage is now it's able to capture like going back and forth and lots of backtracking. Because if you have two dungeons you do in parallel, it'll just do the whole dungeon at once. It won't try to do it. Or if you can do a dungeon early, but only partially, but it can also just do the whole dungeon all at once later, it'll just do it all at once later. And it'll tell you that kind of information that you would actually care about for like someone who's actually playing through the game. And it'll tell you like if a seed's really bad, usually a bad seed has like you have to enter a dungeon multiple times, you have to get an item, then go across the world, and get another item and go back across the world, and like that kind of stuff. Things that actually just add a lot of travel time. And so this will tell you the real problem is that one of it is that actually figuring out the fastest route is very hard. Even approximation is very difficult. If people are familiar with computer science, it's kind of similar to the traveling salesman problem, but worse. And that's already been a known difficult problem to solve, meaning that, and by difficult, I mean that it's very, very long time to calculate. And
Traveling salesman problem with block puzzles and keys.
yeah, it's pretty horrifying, actually. So if someone were to actually implement anything like this, they would need to find some sort of approximation, something that is reasonably fast and gives you like a decent route, maybe not the best route, but something that's like good enough to give you at least a good idea of how to characterize the seed. The other problem, which is potentially less useful, and maybe this is a reason just to use this with the sphere algorithm at the same time, is that you no longer have like the alternate routes. Like it'll just give you, hey, this is like the fastest route, or this is a good route. But you don't have like, oh, but you can also do this other route that's basically just as fast, and it's like completely different, right? It's like whether you do dungeon A before B or B before A is like fairly irrelevant to the algorithm maybe, but it'll just tell you one. And so you just look at it, you'll just say like, oh, I can't do it the other way around because there's nothing in it that kind of apparently makes that even that's possible. So it might be good to kind of like look at both of them in some way. But I think this algorithm just gives you a lot more information in general.
Useful information, certainly.
Yes.
The sphere algorithm is not actually meant to do all the things that are it's like not meant to do any of those.
Yeah.
But people will
Well,
lean.
you try to use whatever information you have, and right now that's kind of like the main information we're providing at all from the randomizer.
It's true.
I know another common thing that some people do, like for example, Rabby Ribby, what they do is they create a heuristic. So they write like a function that basically has like a bunch of things that it's looking for in the seed and some way to characterize it in a simpler way. And then they generate a seed, and then it evaluates like some properties of the seed in a much more simple way, and like something that's much more proximate. And then what they do though is, and then they just generate tons of seeds. And so if you want to say like, hey, I want a seed that's like really long, just give me a really long seed, right? Then you can give it this heuristic, and it'll just keep running until it gives you a seed that's like sufficiently long. And that way you like know, you have some idea of what the seed looks like when you play, which competitively you probably don't really want, but casually it'd be pretty interesting to do because like maybe you're just tired of doing pendencies or whatever. Yeah. So that's kind of that general idea. And that's most of the theory I was planning on talking about, but I'm willing to cover more in the QA at the end. One of the last things I kind of want to cover is that there are a lot of variations of randomizers beyond just what we've been talking about here so far. I don't know, people in the panel, a lot of people in the panel have worked on some of them, so I want to start Boardface to talk about some of the things that you've done to randomize the game in other ways.
Well, yeah. So what's interesting about Final Fantasy IV is that there are 4 randomizers for it. There were 3 around before I made Free Enterprise. There's no rule that says there only has to be 1 randomizer per game, because randomizer design really is game design. You're never just going in and saying, I'm going to randomize this, and that's your entire task. You are always making decisions about what kind of experience you want your player to have. So Free Enterprise is different in that it is the open world kind of randomizer for Final Fantasy IV, which makes it a little bit more, free form. You can choose your route rather than having to follow the linear story. There's also an Ancient Cave style randomizer, which just focuses really heavily on the battle mechanics and giving you like a roguelike experience of going top down to the bottom. There's the Lunarian Shuffle, which preserves the story and then just changes the characters around so you can see them in wacky new situations, and gives a really well-balanced playthrough. And there's also a Beyond Chaos style randomizer, which is being done by Pink Puff, and it just goes wacky. Everybody has a random name, enemies do random stuff, everybody looks random colors. It's just the full-on random, crazy kind of randomizer. But there's so many different ways you can take it.
Yeah, I think what I would want to add here is that even though we've gone into sort of the theory behind randomizers, particularly the Zelda ones in a lot of depth, there are dozens of randomizers out there, some that just modify game data, some that make crossover randomizers between different games. And for anyone out there who's really interested in writing a randomizer, it's a lot more simple than you might think. And a really great example is one of the folks in the Randomania community, Dad Infinitum, who basically he did the Super Mario Land 2 randomizer, and it was quite literally his first programming language, or first programming project as he was learning programming languages for the first time. So it's definitely very accessible for folks to write their own randomizers. Yes, you can go into some of the more nitty-gritty details, but I would definitely encourage, if there's a game that you really love and there isn't a randomizer out there, to get in touch with the folks in the Randomania Discord. There's a lot of resources to help you out with that.
Well, weirdly, the Link to the Past randomizer, the site, is actually 3 different randomizers that the community built, and we kind of put together under one house. It's the entrance randomizer, the enemizer, which is a completely different idea behind randomization, where the game itself isn't, like, the items aren't moved around, but the enemies are, and the bosses, and you shuffle them all around and play the game, which mostly we've been talking about item type randomizers. And it's another really cool way to do randomization without actually affecting, like, you generally don't need much logic at all for throwing enemies in different places. You might need a lot of assembler hacking, but it's kind of one of those cool things. But yeah, so we just kind of merged all of the ones that were kind of budding and becoming really solid. And one of the big things is the community. You just share with other people. If, like you said, the Randomania Discord, and there's a few other Discords that you can go find and contact the people that have made randomizers. Ask them, like, hey, how did you do this? And like talk to them like, I want to work on, I don't know, the randomizer for some game that's really no one plays, Goonies 2. And and then just kind of talk to the people in the community and be like, hey, how is there a way that I can help you? You can help me, kind of stuff like that.
Yeah, I got started in ROM hacking by stumbling onto Crow when he was working on the Lunarian Shuffle, and before that, I had never done any ROM hacking at all. This was a little over a year ago. So I just got involved in randomizers and ROM hacking by wanting to contribute to that project. I learned a little bit more as it got more, and then I just got more ambitious.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to see what people do because there's a lot of games out there that don't really have a lot of like this like constrained world. Like you have like Mario games and stuff like that, and people still want to find ways that that's kind of what is the purpose of randomizer, and they still want to take that approach of like making this new game for any of these games, and like there's a lot of things you can randomize, like say the order that you play through the game, like maybe some of the layouts, like I think some of the. You said, I think, Tetra, you're telling me about like one of the Mario randomizer that has like randomized platforms or something.
I don't think that was me, but I know that I think for Mario 1 there was one that procedurally generates levels.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. Yeah, and I know Zelda 2 has like a randomized like overworld, and I think Zelda 1 there's one for randomized dungeon layouts and such.
Yep, that's not my randomizer, but it's definitely out there.
And I mean, if you look at some of the older ones, I mean, Pokemon is like the original randomizer out there. And Pokemon, like, it's not very progression heavy, but you can just randomize the moves, randomize the stats. And it's like playing like this new RPG. And I think it's really interesting for people to play it that way, even though it's just a very like different kind of experience. But there's like other ways, like, I mean, you have like arcade, which is, there's made by Bjorn, which is, like, I mean, that one doesn't even have an end goal. There isn't like even an objective. You just go through random rooms, and the game gets progressively harder, and you just try to get as much high score as you can get. And it's just like a challenge to see how far you can go. And constraint randomizer is the idea that you can change what you need in the world. And so there might be additional barriers, fewer barriers, whatever, to get around the world. And that just has these massive changes to how the game plays.
I think with one of the Mega Man games, it actually changes what weapon enemies are most weak to. So that can definitely change your play style considerably.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to see what people come up with. I mean, the multi-world cross-world, I guess currently is more of a Ocarina of Time, Link to Past Your Metroid thing, but there's nothing about it that's like inherent to like those games. I mean, all they are is like as long as you have a way for the game code has a way to like send a signal that the player got an item, and have a way to tell the game that they should be getting an item from someone else. And then you just have some script that goes over the internet. Like all these games can do it. I mean, the multi-world like Super Metroid Link to Past, I mean, and Crossword are basically the same thing, except for instead of being between Super Metroid and Link to Past, it's just between Ocarina of Time and Ocarina of Time. Mm-hmm. But that one particularly is extra interesting because they were able to fit both the games on one cart, which is like...
Everything worked out was the statement. It was just they used completely different memory addresses, so it was just like, works.
Yeah, that's just crazy to me.
I still cannot fathom how that's possible, just based on what I know about SNES hacking.
Yeah, I think like Super Metroid's like low ROM, and I think like Zelda's high ROM also. So it's like they don't even use the same kind of memory architecture, and it's like what? I don't know. It works somehow. So, but yeah, it's really cool and see what people do. I have listed in here Story Randomizer, which is more of a kind of alluding to the idea that instead of all these randomizers you've talked about, the most part of these progression kind of styles kind of build these Metroidvania style progression. The idea of Story Randomizer is you try to make a game that plays a little more like normally like a natural game, like particularly Zelda, because you want to make a Zelda randomizer that might make a game that plays like a Zelda game, like as like someone had made it. And the idea of Story Randomizer is that you would first come up like, okay, what is the order of the dungeons? How are they gonna play through with the order of the items? And then like basically rewrite the game randomly so that it like enforces that ordering. But it's more of a project. I think is just something people should consider. Just new ways to randomize things beyond just like kind of getting to the archetypes and doing the same thing as everyone else.
I don't know. I got nothing else.
Okay, we're getting pretty close to the QA time because we're yep. Okay, so one thing I talk about is the Randomania community, which is this huge community of a lot of different randomizers kind of all in one place. It's a really good place to find them, and there's a site here that has like, there's like, what, like 100 or so?
I lost count.
Yeah, it's just,
There's a lot.
There's a lot of randomizers out there, and if you're just really want to go out there and play and to see what's out there, they maintain it pretty well, and it's a pretty good list there. And you can also join their Discord, and there's like people to help set you up and stuff like that. So
Yeah, and I think the majority of randomizers are open source, and the folks who maintain them would love to have pull requests for new features, and I definitely welcome them for my randomizers. So it's also a really opportunity for you to get involved in the community if that's what you're interested in.
okay, and I think on that note, I think this is a good time for QA. So if people have any questions they'd like to ask any of the devs about Randomizer, ideally, then feel free to ask.
Go ahead.
So there's a mic over there. Yeah.
Oh, I have no idea. Go over there. Take. I just thought everyone was getting up because they're like, it's good.
Time to go.
My question is actually about cheating, because as there are so many racers and racing tournaments of all your different randomizers, there's always going to be that one cheater. What my question is about is, what was your different measures to counteract that? Because I know at some point in A Link to the Past randomizer, there was somebody could generate like 10 seeds in advance, and then they would know when their race seed would come along, oh, the items are probably going to be there, and there was a patch for that. So what were your different measures for your different randomizers?
Well, I'll start with that one. That one was
Good luck.
the programming language had a PRNG problem where it would actually seed poorly on the server, and then it would have just continued like bad generations after that. One, switch to CS PRNG, which is cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generation. We also have other measures that we put into the ROM that we don't publicize so much to assist with that. But this is there's a bit of security that you're never going to get, because a determined cheater will find a way to cheat. That's just going to happen. There are some other options on the table that we've been discussing, but in reality, determined cheaters are going to cheat.
Yeah, I think I would add to that is because part of security obscurity is not very good security, but for like OoT, there's a certain amount of encryption that we do in various places to try to make it, if you want to like look at the ROM, to be able to try to get the information out of it, and that's just more challenging. But of course, like any kind of problem along these lines, as long as you're able to play the game, it's very difficult to be able to stop the player from being able to find the information as well. So there's a certain amount you just kind of have to try to reduce cheating as much as possible, but there's only so much you're going to be able to do in a competitive scene.
Yeah, with the problem is that when, especially on an older system, when you're emulating like Super Nintendo game or something, and you're literally simulating the computer, and basically the same tools that we used to build the randomizer in the first place are the same tools that you can use to go in and look at everything that's happening. So, you're always trying to stay ahead of what's going on, but ultimately just the fact that the entire computer's brain is literally there in front of you to look at is a problem.
Thank you.
All right, I got a question for pretty much all of you guys. With multiple versions of the vanilla ROMs out there, I know with Links to the Past we've got 1.0 through 1.2 or 1.3, whatever it is. How do you land on which version you're going to use for Randomizer?
For us, it was very simply the randomizer came out of the speedrunning community. The speedrunning community used the JP 1.0 because it had certain glitches in it that were very much liked. And we're like, that's the one we're going to go with, even though it has other weird constraints that we have to deal with, like the text system.
Yeah, OOT is unfortunately in the speedrunning community, they don't have any kind of standardized version that people use because they all have different glitches. But I'm gonna say that as someone who wasn't around for this original decision, I probably am not going to be able to give you a real answer for OOT. But part of it is that we were trying to choose a version that avoided some of the major glitches that avoid in some places that for stability, and then try to work in the various other things to be able to basically just have the most stability across all platforms to be able to play on, like N64 and PC and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think with Zelda 1, there's the speedrunning community predominantly uses the US versions, and the two of them are only subtly different, and so it doesn't really cause issues. Yeah.
Free Enterprise uses US version 1.1 just because, as I mentioned, I got started on that by using FF Forkster's reference, and that editor uses US version 1.1, so that's how that happened.
All right, thanks, guys.
Sure.
My question, I think, is going to be more for the Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time developers. It was about the assumed fill that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned that it could be greedy and then screw itself over and make itself unable to finish. So I'll use Link to the Past for the example off the top of my head. You place the keys and compasses first. So you start with maybe 216 items. You get those out of the way. You got 150 items. And I'm imagining myself writing this for another game. And the first decision I'm going to make, maybe randomly, is, okay, so I've got 150 other items in my inventory. Let's put the mitts in Ganon's Tower big key chest. So now I've got 149 items to place and 75 places to put them because I just locked myself out of half the game. What's the next step of assumed fill to not dead end myself like that?
Oh, well, you actually not dead-ended.
Really?
You're going to place items that there are points where you will lock off certain sections where you've already placed an item. But theoretically, as you place more items, it should reopen those up.
Oh.
Yeah, so usually the way it works is that when you're placing an item, you're always placing in a spot that that item doesn't need to reach. So like while placing an item, it can never be self-locking. So after you place the item, assuming that you're playing with all locations reachable is your goal, every time you place an item after it's finished being placed, you now have 100% accessibility to the world. You lose accessibility in the while you're still placing the item. So but as you said, it is possible that you can place items that open up a lot of locations in deep spots, and then as you're placing more items later, the world can be very constrained, and it's possible that that you can find no items to place, but that really kind of comes down to you just have to kind of try it, honestly, and just see how often does the seed fail. Because like I said, for most of the Zelda games that I've worked with, generally you're placing items, it's so unlikely to happen, if it even is possible at all with how RNG works, that it's kind of a fairly non-issue for the most part. But if it was a problem, for example, in Ocarina of Time, keys, as I mentioned, we actually put extra rules into the logic that specifically says okay, in this situation, this chest has to be a key, and stuff like that. So you can add special hard-coded constraints to the placement algorithm to try to skip some of those dead ends that you know for sure would happen.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
No, we're good.
Hey guys, just first of all, I wanted to say, thank you to all of you for making these randomizers in the first place, kind of breathing new life into all these games that many of us have been playing for many, many years now and everything. So first of all, just want to say thank you for that. My question is for any of you really, have you ever been contacted by any sort of developer, programmer, or just anyone who's worked on the games you've randomized before, and have they ever said anything to you or given thanks to you or any sort of interaction of that kind?
No.
Yeah, I don't think we have either. In some ways, I feel like they did. I would be very afraid because it's more likely than not they're going to be please stop doing this.
Yep, I haven't either.
Yeah, when you're playing with other people's intellectual property, there's always a little bit of a tightrope to walk there, and you got to be careful about it. But I think that also, even if one of them did want to reach out, they might be under similar constraints. They don't want to be in a situation where it looks like they're tacitly approving your project on behalf of the company or that sort of thing either. So.
I think there are examples where devs have reached out to some of the randomizers and with fairly positive though. So for example, I mentioned before Rabby Ribby, and in the Rabby Ribby, the developer of the game, after they made their randomizer, reached out to them and they're like, oh, this is a really cool project, and they're really supportive, and they added some tools to the game to make it easier to be able for them to randomize, including they added more event IDs and item IDs so they can add those things in for the randomizer, and also they added tools to be able to load custom maps more easily. So in some ways, I think maybe the indie developers are probably more open for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely indie developers. I know, for example, the devs of Celeste have definitely worked with modders, and they've deliberately made their game easier to mod.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Got a question about quality of life updates and where you draw the line. So FF4, you said, let's see, quicker menuing, faster walking, and things like that. But when do you stop fixing problems with games or leave in a bad feature of a game because it's charming, or some bad text, you know?
So Link to the Past, we left an error that we made. A guy named Bob, he's a little anti-fairy in Ganon's Tower. If you don't bonk the torch item and get it. But we have a weird kind of back and forth about like quality of life. The speedrunners want to have like the most vanilla game possible, and I respect that. But then there are the people who are a lot more casual who are like, I don't care that the menu takes a second to slide down and a second to slide up. I just want it there instantly, or I want to be able to quick swap, which are just not things in the original game. And I think it's we walk a line and we're like, hey, if somebody wants to code it and we can fit it in and it makes sense to be like a quality of life feature, we'll throw it in. But if nobody on the dev team is actually interested in writing the code, we just move on.
Yeah, with Final Fantasy IV, so inventory management is a big problem in Final Fantasy IV. You only have about 48 slots in your inventory in that game, and normally in vanilla, it's not a big deal, but when you're running around collecting as much treasure as you do in free enterprise, that fills up quick. So some people like ask for a bigger inventory. It turns out that's actually pretty hard to do for a number of reasons. So, you know, there are some quality of life improvements there that are a little less clear cut as, you know, this is just speeding up a menu is one thing, but adding the ability to throw away a treasure as soon as you find it, rather than, or there's a quick trash option where instead of having to individually drag each option down to the trash can, you can double click the trash can and just start shoving stuff into it. I think the key difference there is that these aren't like intellectually difficult decisions. Like, a person knows that they want to get rid of an item and they can do it. It's not hard to do. I mean, there's maybe some like, I guess a little bit of speed to consider with just like, I guess, pathing your menu, if that's going to be a thing. But I think a lot of runners are just kind of, when it takes up a lot of time, and they just want to get back to the point where they can start making intellectual, interesting decisions about their gameplay again. So I think that's where a lot of their interest lies. But really, I think it comes more down to a case by case, listening to your community, considering all your feedback. Once you start building a community about your randomizer, people are pretty vocal about what they'd like to see in it. So you will never have a dearth of suggestions from that point ever again.
Thanks very much. Anybody else?
Yeah, I guess OOT is always challenging. It's the same as everything else. There's a lot of features where we want to add various speed ups, and then we add them, and then there's always someone that complains saying that, but I liked it slow. You know, I wanted it to take a long time, and there's always kind of it's a tightrope. It's like, at what point do you draw a line? Like, you can't just add like a million options for like every single like, oh, this block you can push faster, but the rest of them you can't. And it's like, there's a certain point you kind of have to like, you know, accept it one way or the other. But I think in general, from a wider audience, it's I think a lot of speedrunners like it when you don't change things too much, generally speaking, and they try to keep things a little more stable. But at the same time, a lot of these quality of lives are just so significant for just the casual side that sometimes you just need to add them in. So,
Thanks.
Okay, I have a question. So let's say I wanted to make a randomizer, and I've got the algorithm, I've got all the ASM done, I've got everything done. At what point do you beta test it, and then at what point do you release it to the public?
I guess the first question is, how are you going to release it? I mean, are you going like web-based, so online versus offline? Once you've made that decision, then more follows.
Yeah. Honestly, one thing I've found is, I mean, it wasn't a decision I made, it was a decision the person who founded the LTTP randomizer project, Desirek, made, which I thought was actually a really good idea, was to have the speed gaming community, have the speed runners be the beta testers, because speedrunners are really, really good at breaking the game. And if anyone's gonna find the issues, like that's where you start, is start with the speedrunning communities for sure, because you know, that's where you're gonna get the you know, the real results, the real like the real heavy testing.
Yeah, and for OOT, we basically have like 2 versions of the randomizer out at any given time. We basically have like this like kind of nightly developer build, which, you know, might work one night, might not work another night. You never know. But people are very happy to use it because it has, you know, lots of new features, and they're very like really thankful for people who, you know, test it out and give bug reports, and we can like look into fixing them. And at some point, usually we basically have a feature freeze, and we're just like, okay, we're not adding anything new. We're just fixing bugs at this point. And then once we are happy, we feel like it's been stable for a few weeks and nothing's happening, then we go ahead and like make an official release that people can play on a bit more easily. It's generally how we've done it.
I mean, I generally let folks open beta test randomizers I work on, but it definitely is important to have a stable version that's separate from anything that's currently in development. And I think as long as you set expectations properly, like say, hey, there's a possibility that this seed from the beta might not be beatable, that I think most people are willing to, you know, test it just as long as they're not getting something different than what they expected. So managing expectations for it is really important.
Yeah, Free Enterprise got started when I was, my first release of that, I was in the channel of the Final Fantasy IV Speedrun Discord, and they have a channel for running hacks, and I just said, hey, here's a thing that we kind of maybe talked about briefly if you want to start trying it, and here it is. It's just kind of a small, cheapest release, but also, again, with the support of the speedrunners, you can really go far. If you're working on a game that doesn't have like a big speedrunning community or it's on Discord, the Randomania Discord has a channel specifically about development. And they're always eager to hear about projects that are in progress and stuff that gets released. So that's a really great place for new randomizers to get started.
Cool, thank you.
All right, probably time for like one more quick question.
Hey, this isn't really a question. It's more so adding on to one of the previous questions that was answered. I just want to mention that for OT specifically, I remember talking to Amazing Ampharos back in the early stages of development, and he mentioned that he chose to base the randomizer on version 1.0 because it had more documentation.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think there's actually the most documentations for like the debug version of the ROM, but it's pretty similar, so that actually makes a lot of sense.
All right, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Well done.
All right, well, I guess that is the end of our randomizer panel, and just thank you everyone for joining us. It was a lot of fun. It was really interesting to, you know, having everyone talk about, you know, their viewpoints, and I guess you're free.